Story 1. Trying to go somewhere you had never been before was an epic adventure. You had to look at paper maps and ask strangers for directions. Story 2. I think back to a friend who passed away in 2001 who never got online or used a cell phone in her life. She had physical disabilities and could not really leave the house without a lot of pain. Her world became so small and lonely. She would watch the shopping channel QVC, whose name stands for quality, value, convenience, or the weather channel when she was awake all night, just for company. When my ex and I went to a new restaurant, we would bring her a paper takeout menu so she could see what the restaurant was like. She kept a notebook by her chair full of recipes she saw on television and funny jokes she had heard. She read a lot, did crosswords, waited for Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune to watch with friends, and circled shows she looked forward to in the television guide. She was one of the best humans I have ever had the privilege of knowing, but I often think of how the internet could have made her days less lonely. Amazon and Walmart delivery, telehealth appointments, FaceTime and Zoom conversations, even mobile gaming or World of Warcraft would have made her life easier and connected her with other people. She would have loved Reddit, that is for sure. Thank you all for the kind words. Computers were available at the time, but not nearly as ubiquitous. She was in her 50s and had gone that long without them, so it seemed like more of a hassle to learn. Do not worry. She was blissfully married for life to her best friend, but he had to work. She was an introvert as well, but I am sure the internet would have made things better. Story 3. We had patience for things. I was born in the 1980s, and I will bet we are the last generation to remember what it is like to send handwritten letters to friends, and the excitement of coming home every day to open the mailbox, hoping to see if my friends had written back. Also, if we decide on Tuesday morning to meet up on Friday at 2 in the afternoon in front of the arcade, we will all show up on time. I loved reading all the responses. I did not expect to feel nostalgic and melancholy today from sharing tidbits of my childhood. So many anecdotes made me feel warm and fuzzy, like looking at old photographs. Thank you. Story 4. Many things were better, but boredom was something you had to fight. People went out and did things much more often. Most people did not stay in the house. Story 5. It must have been nice not to be glued to screens all day. I kind of miss a world I never even lived in. Story 6. It's not the internet, but the rise of data harvesting and algorithmic manipulation that many people's nostalgia is pushing back against. Story 7. The news was slower. More people read the newspaper. Smartphones did not exist. Video calling was still regarded as a science fiction idea. Story 8. Dating was in person. You had to meet girls in the wild, ask for their numbers, call them, and try not to sound like a tool. You also could not ghost or discard people so easily. It was more challenging. Clout was in real time. There were no followers online. Your status had to be demonstrable. School was more difficult in many ways. A research report felt like death. It involved going to the library for hours, searching through books for information, then spending a small fortune copying pages before you could even begin writing. Work meant applying or asking for an application in person. Many jobs, as today, were given via referrals. They mailed your paycheck or you picked it up and went to a bank to cash or deposit it. Credit cards were used, but cash was used much more. Information was consolidated into magazines, newspapers, and television. Most people read the newspapers to find out what was going on. Entertainment held more value because it was not as accessible. You had to go to the record store, hope they had the record, and then spend money on it. Then you owned and cherished the record. Same with movies. Movie rental was a big deal because it was expensive to buy the tapes. Radio mattered. Your radio station of choice said something about your personality. Being bored and not knowing was accepted. Interestingly, there was less misinformation that could get through, so people were less misinformed in many ways. Going viral in the 1980s and earlier meant urban legends. You heard about Richard Gere and the gerbil by word of mouth on the playground. Story 9. Where I grew up, you could find the odd porn magazine in bins or discarded in bushes. There were enough that I am still drawn to anything that looks like a discarded glossy magazine. A friend and I once found a shopping bag full of women's magazines in the park behind our house. We were too young to know what to do with them, but we were curious about the contents, so we left them for the next group of kids. Story 10. Better. More authentic, private, mannerly, respectful, and patient. Less narcissistic and self-serving. More genuine interactions and peacefulness. Story 11. You have no idea how many times I read the shampoo bottle while taking a poop. Story 12. Politics was not the most important thing in people's lives and was not discussed constantly. Most people did not base their entire identity on their political beliefs, and many considered discussing politics poor form. Story 13. Conversations were deeper. Research was harder but more rewarding. Video games were much better. The library was an exciting place to go. We had to call toll-free numbers to find showtimes for movies at the theater. I mean, honestly, just go watch Roseanne, the original show. That's what life was like. Story 14. It was much more peaceful and absolutely just as fun, if not more. People tend to think, oh my God, I bet it was so boring, but not at all. It was healthier. People talked. You had real friends, not a screen. Story 15. One of the worst parts was being beholden to the television scheduling gods. We had to find out when our show aired on what channel, and sometimes even learn how to program a video cassette recorder to watch it. Networks changed time slots and air dates so often it was easy to miss an episode. If you did, too bad, you might only catch it on reruns years later. Story 16. I grew up in the 1970s and got to explore. The movies were true. My parents would announce that you had to leave the house early in the morning. It was either leave or be stuck doing chores. Out of sight, out of mind. Sure, I'm going over to Tommy's. Then I was gone. I would get on my bike or hop a train, turn the stile, and disappear for the day. Honestly, I am surprised I am still alive sometimes. Story 17. People were kinder and their expectations were lower. There was no social media, so we were free from the judgments of others unless we knew them in real life. All interactions, business or personal, were with a human being on the phone or in person. It was a much better time. We had hope. Story 18. Better. Also worse. There is less nonsense. Flat Earth believers probably always existed, but they were separated by distance and therefore unable to assemble and make a meaningful impact. They had to live among normal, rational people who regularly insulted them, put them down, and confronted them with reality. Now they can communicate and gather online, and because they feel a numerical weight, they begin to think their views are valid. The worst part is that information used to travel much more slowly, which left room for falsehoods to gain traction without question. Consider the woman who sued McDonald's over hot coffee that spilled on her. McDonald's, as a large company with substantial resources, was able to change public perception very effectively. Because the case involved a single person with no public voice, there was no counter-narrative to the company's portrayal of her. For years, they made her look like a gold digger until the truth gained traction online and became well known. Every technology has good and bad sides. It is easy for some people to romanticize the pre-internet past, but while the internet has serious problems, overall it has probably been a force for the betterment of humanity. Story 19. Simpler times. The nutbags still existed, but you did not have to hear from them, and they did not congregate to make everyone else's lives harder. Connections were deeper because people did not have their heads shoved into their phones around the clock. Knowledge was harder to come by, so it meant more. I mean, I can use artificial intelligence to pull out some Doctor of Philosophy level physics if I wanted. And I am as dumb as a barn door when it comes to that stuff. We have tried to make everything easier, and really we have just made it all a mess. Caveat: I also believe it has done a lot of good, but I would rather complain. Story 20. I ran the neighborhood, knocking on friends' doors to round up the gang and even speaking with parents face to face. Wild times. Story 21. If you were somewhat healthy, you would just stare out the window, think, or go outside. Story 22. I was born in 1992, so the internet did technically exist, but it was pretty limited in scope for the average household until I was a little older. I remember poring through general knowledge books like the annual Kids Almanacs and compact disc read-only memory discs such as Encarta Encyclopedia for hours. Trends like Pokemon cards would catch on only once you saw them in person, when some kid at school had them, or you saw them at the mall or in a television commercial. Many things felt more time-sensitive and urgent. If you had a favorite television show, you had to be seated by the television exactly when it aired to watch it, or make sure you had loaded a video home system tape to record it, or later use TiVo. Good luck finding a song you liked if you heard it randomly in a store or on television without the title displayed during the music video or commercial. I first heard One More Time when I saw the music video on television when I was 5 years old, and remembered it but did not know how or where to find it until iTunes arrived about 8 years later. Story 23. As a kid, we used to call our friends every night after school, but we were only allowed to use the phone after 6 p.m. in the United Kingdom when calls were cheaper. We had to carry guidebooks on holiday and book trips at travel agencies. I would say it was both good and bad. Story 24. Life was full of mystery. What happened to Dave? Nobody has seen him for 20 years. What is it like to live in New York? It was mysterious and wonderful. We are less ignorant now, but life was magical in a way people cannot appreciate anymore. Story 25. Unlike the nostalgia merchants, I would say it was miserable, but you did not pour it out to the whole world. You had problems. You were bullied, you compared yourself to others, and people cheated. The only difference was that the circle was small. Story 26. I was born in 1978, graduated in 1996, and finished college in 2000. I was a web developer at the time. There were no classes for it. It was all self-taught. I did take all of the Macromedia courses which my internship comped: Dreamweaver, Flash 3, and Director. I was using ECMA Script 2 and ECMA Script 3, European Computer Manufacturers Association, Flash 3 before ActionScript, and Director 5 for CD-ROM, compact disc read-only memory, development when I graduated. I did not take a single computer science course. Every class I took felt pointless, except that it showed me what not to do. The only classes worth taking were the ones that taught me how to think, not what to think. Logic, psychology, theology, and similar subjects. Those classes opened my mind. Then I took an English literature course, Carver and Cheever, and I was no longer the same person. I switched when I realized in The Swimmer that he was not actually diving into his neighbor's pools, that it was a large metaphor for diving into their psyches. I rejoiced. I immediately stopped using that racial slur that day. Just kidding. I was pretty dumb. It was great. I lived on my bike. That was my freedom. We had no cable, we were pretty broke, but we had a house and dogs. It was a place called Damascus, Oregon. It is on the way up to Mount Hood. Somehow out of our little town a few people broke out and went on to do big things. Back then there was no phone in your pocket, so no one could just mess with you in real time. Pagers had just started but were for drug dealers. Respect. Answering machines were everywhere, so you check who missed you when you got home. No built-in pressure to respond immediately. Just watch Ace Ventura. Story 27. People would much more often just ring the doorbell to check on you. Story 28. We spent most of the day outside when we were not at school. No one was vitamin D deficient. We did all kinds of stupid things that will never be known to random people because they weren't recorded and posted online. Story 29. I remember being able to sit and relax. I could simply sit and stare into nature without feeling the need to get up, do something, or look at my phone. Story 30. We used maps to reach places we did not know how to get to. I kept a folded map in the door of my car. I asked for directions at a gas station or from someone on a corner. My friends and I would hop on a road and drive with no idea where we were going. We discovered things along the way and tried to remember how to get back. It was awesome. Story 31. Kids would knock on your front door to see if you were home and wanted to come out. You did not call and set up a time. Kids made plywood bike ramps, and any new movie you wanted to see was not on a streaming app. You went to the video rental store and rented a video home system tape for a day or two, then returned it. If you did not rewind it, you were charged. When you played video games with friends, until the Nintendo 64 came out, there were only 2 players, and you had to be on the same system using the same television. You were not playing online with your buddies on a server. You could not ask Google a question or use Chrome to find an answer. For research and information, you went to the library. Instead of renting, the library let you borrow books for about a week, and you returned them. Before the internet, you learned about major celebrity news from the newspaper or the 6 o'clock news. Without the internet, people did not have as many contacts in their phone books, but a smaller percentage were known well and had stronger bonds. People connected in person and were more truthful because they did not have personal online profiles to hide behind. People had to look each other in the eye when interacting. People looked like their pictures. There were no filters to fool anyone. We could not order things online from sites like Amazon. We went to the mall and could get everything we needed there except groceries. Without the internet, preparing for the day was harder. The news gave you the weather and things to be aware of. You could listen to the radio newscast as well, but it was the same information without visuals. Long-distance communication was done by telephone lines and radio waves. It did not provide visuals or a collection of multiple reports on the same situation to give fuller information for better predictions and insight. Calling the movie theater to find showtimes could take a long time, sometimes being transferred from switchboard to switchboard. Now you type the movie into Google and instantly get an overload of information. Story 32. Things were a lot better. I was not bombarded with information around the clock. We went outside all the time. I was inside mainly to eat, sleep, and watch cartoons. Otherwise, we were riding around, doing mischief and getting into trouble because there was nothing else to do. All harmless, but it still annoyed some adults. I love technology and have had a good career in it, but it's more of a hindrance to everyday life in many ways. Story 33. If you did not know something and your mother did not either, you simply had to accept not knowing. Story 34. We could not wait for the next edition of our niche magazine to arrive in the mail. We had to keep up with the latest trends. Story 35. My brain with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder would always need something to read. I did a lot of newspaper crossword puzzles and had several magazine subscriptions. Story 36. I grew up well before the web was mainstream, and I genuinely feel that it was much better in some ways but much worse in others. My neighbors and I would play in the woods, climb vines, and wade in a large creek. We dealt with neighborhood drama and roamed around looking for adventure. We had so many questions and so few answers. For me, the internet was like a dream where every question had an answer, and the early internet felt honest. eBay. Oh my God. You could finally find parts for obscure mechanical items, from cars and motorcycles to household appliances, and fix them yourself. Then came social media, which was incredible for a short time until depression set in from comparing your life to others. Everyone's life looked better than it may actually have been because it was a way to display or project an amazing life. Now, in the last decade or more, we are in a muddy water stage of disinformation. Nothing feels real. People turning against each other, widespread depression and anxiety, and possibly the collapse of society, though I hope not. Postscript. Be careful with member berries. Many people remember yesterday as better than it was, mostly because youth and vitality are almost always a person's best time in life. Story 37. It was like Stranger Things. Great music, friends on bikes. Conspiracies were fun to talk about around a fire in the woods. We could read from paper. The world felt safer, that is, we did not know about the dangers of those people. There was no pause on television, so we had to watch it when it was on, and there were no full series releases. Or we could record it on a video cassette for later, if tape space permitted. The world was much bigger. I really miss it. This is why the thought of a solar flare knockout does not terrify me. It might save us all. Story 38. Born in 1976. As a kid, we played outside. We explored creeks, built bike jumps, and spent any earned or found money at the 7-Eleven on snacks our parents would not buy us. We invented all kinds of fun. We collected and traded baseball cards and got into Dungeons and Dragons. In the late 1980s, my friend got a Nintendo, but my parents would not get me one, so we occasionally played Mike Tyson's Punch-Out at his house. Sometimes we played King's Quest on my parents' International Business Machine's personal system too. In the 1990s, I started high school. We listened to compact discs, watched movies, hung out at each other's houses, and played hoops, wiffle ball, and ping pong. Every night after homework, we called girls we liked on the telephone. Often their parents answered, so we had to use our respectable voices. We drove around looking for parties in parking lots and fields. The parties often were not there, but it was not a big deal. We tried to get laid. Sometimes, very rarely, we did. We looked at the box scores in the newspaper every morning. We did not give much of a damn about politics. Story 39. As much as I'd like to say it was better, I think the best days were the early internet when a 9600 baud modem was common. Dialing into a bulletin board system was great, and early websites were fun, mostly homemade and hand-coded. Story 40. I knew phone numbers. My mom's work number, my dad's work number, and my friends' numbers. I could do stupid things and not worry about being filmed. Privacy. That's what I missed the most. Story 41. I was born in the early 1980s. I remember going to friends' houses hoping they would be there and would want to do something. I memorized all my friends' landline numbers and would often reach their parents or siblings first. If we got in trouble, we had nobody to call and no way to look up information or get help, so we had to get ourselves out of the mess. I used to read a lot and watch bad television shows while waiting for The Simpsons to finally come on. I loved my childhood. Story 42. Jebediah would come around with the wagon, and we would go to the 5 and dime store to admire the newfangled soda pop dispenser. Story 43. Ignorance was bliss. Life was much simpler then, with less division in politics, less extremism, and more compromise. We had a shared life experience. Millions watched the same programs on television at the same time, which tended to create a more collective mindset. Journalism used to have integrity, nothing but the facts, or hit the road, Jack. Fewer opinions were disguised as news. Those belonged in the goddamn rag magazines. Analytical thinking was more prevalent. If you needed information, you had to search for it in books, magazines, or microfiche, and because you worked for the information, you retained more. There was less fear overall because the media was not as paranoid. Story 44. We played board games, rolled dice, and played card games. We rode bikes. We read books. We talked to one another. We watched family shows together. Story 45. Idiots couldn't reach a massive audience as easily. You could have a debate without someone looking up the answer online. But the biggest difference was the lack of cameras. Call someone a name and they would just punch you. If you saw something awesome, you would just enjoy it. For holiday photos, you had to go to someone's house to show them. If you embarrassed yourself, nobody who wasn't there would see it. Basically, your life was private. Those were good times. Story 46. Wake up in the morning, pour a cup of coffee, sit on the porch, and read the newspaper. The paper had no rage bait, no hyperbole, and no intrusion of other people's insanity. It was just a report on the latest news. If you felt spicy, you would read the letters to the editor, but those were screened and curated by a sane person. Maybe you would venture over to the editorial page where opinions live. You might say, "What a load of crap," then refill your coffee and never think about it again. Now opinions masquerade as news. Many people cannot tell the difference, and we have all woken up to some random person we have never met raging about our opinions. None of this happened before the internet. Story 47. As crazy as it sounds, we were better informed. A chief purpose of the internet was to foster and disseminate information. Instead, bad actors and fools now spread disinformation that drowns out reliable sources. I am stunned at the falsehoods people believe now. It all changed the day Kelly and Conway said it was necessary to give alternative facts. Before the internet, she would have been shamed into obscurity. Story 48. Better. People talked to each other, played together, and had hobbies. Story 49. Most people accepted the scientific method and relied on evidence rather than magic or conspiracy theories. Medical quackery and outlandish fear-mongering propaganda were confined to esoteric print media. You had to seek them out instead of encountering them every time you went online. Story 50. Everything used to have value. I remember how we enjoyed ourselves just by walking. Story 51. Well, some things were better. On the other hand, I couldn't easily Google anything. Story 52. It was wild. We had to memorize phone numbers, use paper maps that did not rear out when we missed a turn, and if someone wanted to ghost you, they simply moved away. Story 53. You got lost a lot driving. You would just go to a bar or coffee shop and hope your friends showed up. They usually did. News moved a lot slower. It was not this constant breaking news. Story 54. There was much less drama, and children grew up knowing how to communicate with others. Story 55. You had to figure things out yourself, experiment, and try without knowing whether it would work. Story 56. You had to pay attention to street names and ask complete strangers for directions if you got lost. When you got home, you would immediately listen to your answering machine on the shared family phone plugged into the wall to see if anyone had called. We had a television guide booklet to check the schedule. If you were not home during your program, you had to flip through the guide to find a rerun. Or, if you were cool, you could record it on a video cassette. All of these things were considered normal. Story 57. We got more sleep, and looking back, it felt like we had more freedom. Story 58. Paper maps. There was no television remote. I was my mother's remote and could turn the knob from 38 to 56 just by feel and without looking at the numbers. Political and religious conversations were not held. There were only 6 or 7 television stations, and some adults did not watch the news. They worked and pursued hobbies they enjoyed. People who brought up politics were considered crazy and were ignored. Story 59. It was nice because you did not have to know how unintelligent many people are. Story 60. We wrote down the directions carefully while the person on the other end of the line narrated them to us. Story 61. I cannot describe how old that question makes me feel. My answer is that you went to the library, not to Google. Story 62. If you were going somewhere new, you would have to consult a physical map or have someone draw or write directions. If you were meeting someone, you would have to agree on a time and a place and then wait, not knowing if they would be late or unable to come. You would have heated arguments about facts that could last hours, which you can now check quickly online. You would watch a lot of poor quality television because you had to watch whatever was on. Story 63. A lot of people mention boredom, which I believe is necessary to become a better human being. Those moments are when you use your imagination. Now we have technology that thinks for us instead of putting the brain to work. Only people who are not creative feel bored. If your mind is creative enough, you can always entertain yourself. People are becoming too comfortable with having information given to them instead of expanding their minds by figuring things out. Story 64. Life was simpler. You remembered phone numbers, wrote letters, spent time with people without distractions, and played outside all day, returning home only when exhausted. Story 65. I think the most interesting time was when the internet coexisted with landline phones. We would log on and log off, and it was a much more intentional engagement because it was not available everywhere all the time. I loved that period and would like to return to that part of the 1990s. Story 66. Generally, it was simpler and more peaceful. Like everything, it had good and bad aspects. For example, people were more respectful and looked out for one another. Now, you rarely talk to your neighbors and are more likely to call the police or homeowners associations if you have a problem instead of speaking with them directly. The downside was that it was harder to look up information. You carried large maps for navigation, had to memorize phone numbers, and there was greater concern about strangers. Story 67. I took for granted how nice it was not to be bombarded with 24-hour news cycles and notifications. Story 68. Remembering phone numbers was critical for social interaction. The television guide was the go-to resource for planning entertainment, and going to the movies was common. Story 69. We had fewer channels on the television, but we went to the movies. Instead of scrolling, we read newspapers and magazines. Travel was planned with triptychs. We played pinball instead of video games. Life was not that different. Days still revolved around school or work, laundry, groceries, kids, yard work, and so on. Story 70. It was quieter, not being bombarded with constant information. It was lovely. Story 71. Life was wonderful. Books were important and so were people. Story 72. You had the freedom to do anything you wanted without risking someone recording it and posting it online for amusement. Story 73. It used to feel slower. Now everything feels faster. We go from thing to thing too quickly, constantly chasing something and never feeling content or satisfied. Before, we could hang out and talk for hours. If there was a lull, people had nothing to occupy them. We just waited for the next conversation starter. Story 74. People knew how to entertain themselves and developed creativity and imagination beyond childhood in quiet or boring times. Story 75. The fads seem to be more social than they are today. I would spend hours at a friend's house having Pokemon battles, Beyblade battles, working on school projects, and watching movies. Multiplayer video games were on one screen and everyone had to be in the same room, looking at the same screen. We talk a lot about community and how people knew their neighbors. I do not miss the gossiping mothers. I would prefer them to social media shaming, but those women really did not have a life. The awareness and understanding of neurodiversity, mental health, and mental illness that we have now did not exist then. I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it was hidden for the most part because being neurodivergent was stigmatized. I remember a couple of boys in elementary school, one with autism and one with Down syndrome. Students knew who they were. They did not treat them badly, but they did not befriend them. The goal for the parents seemed to be to raise them until they could be sent away to a care facility. There was also a disdain for therapy. If you went to therapy, you were considered crazy. Story 76. Calmer. We actually had to tell people in person that we did not like them. Story 77. Nature was different. There were more places to play football. Sandy pitches belonging to local clubs, now replaced by fences, and many green spaces where nobody minded a hole in the fence behind some bushes so children could play at a real goal instead of using 2 backpacks. That was great, but those places are gone and my children will not experience them. We also told our parents when we were going out and agreed on a time to be home. I cannot imagine that now. The internet has made many things easier, but times also changed before the internet. I do not miss those days, but I am a bit sad that none of our children, except perhaps in some small villages, will experience it that way. Story 78. This question just made me turn to dust, as if I'd chosen the wrong grail from that Indiana Jones movie. Story 79. We were more connected and interacted in person more often. It was quieter. I remember being bored as a kid, hopping on my bike, riding around the neighborhood and knocking on friends' doors to see who was home to come outside and find something to do. On Halloween, we would be gone for hours and come home with a huge candy haul. It really was a simpler, more peaceful time. Story 80. Phones were attached to the wall, both at home and in public. If you had a set of encyclopedias, that was your Google. Playing outside was the default option. There were basically no remote controls. Everything was operated by hand. Most of our media entertainment was on some form of tape. Any multiplayer video game was split screen, and our televisions were tiny with blurry screens that bulged out a bit. They really looked funny. We read a lot more and listened to radio shows regularly. My first internet connection was called web television. It connected through our family television, ran on dial-up, and would boot you off if anyone called your house phone. Laughing out loud. Ah, the good old days. Thanks for the memories. Story 81. Having internet in your home did not become the norm until I was in my teens, but I was born after the internet was invented. It just took the rest of the world a while to develop technology to make internet access a normal service in private residences. I'm not sure what pre-internet days were like for adults, but as a kid it was epic. I lived in the suburbs with a bunch of other kids my age. We would grab our bikes and explore the neighborhood and the surrounding woods for hours. Trips to the library were a family outing. We would each pick out several books because that would be our quiet entertainment for weeks. We also watched television. You either used a videocassette recorder to record your show, or your rear end had to be in front of the television at a certain time because you were at the mercy of the broadcast schedule. That sometimes caused disagreements when people could not agree on a show to watch since the television was shared. There were video stores where you could rent videocassette tapes, and while my family did that occasionally, we mostly watched live television, played board games, or went to our rooms to read or do crafts quietly on our own. Story 82. The phone's battery lasted 5 to 7 days, but the screen broke if you dropped the phone. Read more books. Story 83. In a word, spontaneous. We did not have the same ability to plan in advance. We had to roll with the punches and live in the moment. I really miss it. Sometimes it feels like the magic of life died a little with constant digital connectivity. The early internet in the very late 1990s and early 2000s was pretty fun. There was just enough technology to be cool and make life easier, but not enough to infringe on the rest of real life. Felt like the ideal balance. Story 84. Expectations were very low for everything. For any school or work project, you would say you are going to the library on certain days and hopefully they have the book you need to complete this. When you left the office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you were physically unable to continue working at home, even if your boss desperately needed you to. So expectations had to be managed accordingly. That no longer applies, laughing out loud. Story 85. I always kept a running list of things to look up at the library. Of course, it took a lot of time to actually look them up, so I had to choose which ones were most important. It was all we knew, so we made do. As a child, when you wondered how the stars stayed in the sky or why the sky was blue, you simply wondered. Now you can look up these things instantly. Magic. Story 86. As children, we went outside and played. Sometimes I was at a friend's house playing slot cars, going swimming, or hanging around while his brother worked on his car. For school, we used an encyclopedia or went to the library to research papers. If you missed a television show, you waited months for it to be rebroadcast as a rerun or for the series to go into syndication. We made mixtapes by recording a song from our vinyl records or waiting until it came on the radio, and you hoped the disc jockey would not talk too much during the intro. It was a very different time. Story 87. In terms of news, cable news network and other 24-hour news sites were available. But most of us waited until 5 p.m. or 10 p.m. Central Time to get the news, weather, and sports. September 11th, 2001 changed that. After that, we wanted news immediately. Story 88. Overall, I am more productive. The internet causes me to lose entire hours of my life, and I am actively trying to avoid doom scrolling. This is a consequence of social media, although social media would not exist without the internet. Having everything you need the moment you think of it steals something essential from people and makes them think less for themselves. Story 89. On the tube, you could have been in a library. Everyone read a paper or a book, apart from the noise of the train. Now everyone stares at their phones and has no idea how to turn the volume down or use headphones. Some shout into their phones with the loudspeaker on, so we all have to hear how dull their lives are. Story 90. It was more relaxed in some ways, but also more frustrating because information was hard to come by and you had to rely on what other people told you without an easy way to verify it. For me, the world opened up when I went online in the mid-1990s. It declined when mobile phones became widely adopted in the mid to late 2000s. Story 91. In a lot of ways, life was simpler. Not necessarily better, I guess, because every era has its downsides. You were pulled in fewer directions at once, and there was less expectation of being always available. Story 92. Life had a pleasant, slow pace, full of anticipation. Now everything is fast and immediate. Story 93. If you wanted to play with a friend, you would use the house phone to call and find out if they were available. Someone else would answer and you would ask if you could speak to so-and-so. Story 94. It was much more liberating. You could do whatever you wanted, and there was virtually no record of it. Story 95. A lot of adventure. People are more willing to ask for and give help, creating closer, tight-knit communities. There are also many unknowns. Story 96. It wasn't just the internet. It was less of everything. I listened to the same children's story on tape countless times. I listened to music I didn't instantly love because that was what I had, and I listened to whole albums. I even watched a Russian school television program as a small child because there was nothing else on. Today, everybody instantly gets what they want, and I think we are losing out. Story 97. Somehow everyone knew the story about Marilyn Manson's rib. Story 98. Flipping through magazines was our version of scrolling Instagram. My parents had subscriptions to Time and National Geographic. My grandmother got us kids a subscription to the Beano. My brother and I would buy Mad magazine. My other grandmother bought a cottage in the Laurentians when I was 12, and it had 4 decades of National Geographic magazines in the attic. I spent at least an hour each visit lying in a hammock, flipping through National Geographic magazines from the 1940s and 1950s. Story 99. You could burn all your bridges and wake up the next day without worrying about the consequences of being an asshole. Story 100. Maybe it was nostalgia, but it was simpler. You did not hear about much. You focused on your immediate real-life circle, and that was it. Envy was lower. We knew about Lamborghinis, but our feeds were not full of them. I miss it a lot. I often think about deleting all social media accounts, but then I would be the only one not up to date or reachable. It is convenient, but it has its drawbacks. People were more punctual, I can say that for sure. Story 101. I was happier not because life was necessarily better, but because I knew less about the difficult parts. Story 102. Navigating from point A to point B was a real skill. There was no Google Maps. Often there were no maps at all. You relied on remembering what someone told you at the gas station. Story 103. It was both boring and calm. There was no on-demand anything, so you lived more in the moment. I definitely did more tactile activities like crafting, board games, and jigsaw puzzles. We spent a lot of time hanging out at each other's houses. Story 104. We walked around with candles in brass holders. We also had to fetch water from the creek with a bucket. Story 105. I think about that a lot when I am out in public spaces like waiting rooms, lines, and parks. I do not remember what people did back then. I find it fascinating not to look at my phone in situations like that and to watch the endless number of people scrolling away their idle, free time. Story 106. It was so much better. Without technology, we spent all our time together with friends and family. It was wonderful. Story 107. Literacy was a thing. You did not follow anyone, and no one followed you except for the creepers. Story 108. We spent time at malls and arcades. There was always that one house where everyone would hang out and play games like Ninja Gaiden on the Nintendo beating levels. We had sleepovers and would sneak out after our parents went to bed. We pitched a tent in the backyard and drank Mad Dog 2020 until we were sick. We built forts in the woods and rode our bikes everywhere. Story 109. Some level of privacy used to exist. Now nothing is secret. Your social security number, bank cards, and other personal information are all out there and will eventually be exposed in a data breach. You are on camera everywhere you go now. To me, that is one of the more important differences. Story 110. It was peaceful but frustrating that the future of technology was not quite there yet. We did not get the dreamscape we had envisioned of a tech-savvy future. Story 111. Oog. You go to the cave and sleep. Here is a spear. Kill the dinosaur and bring food. Story 112. There was no pool of readily available gameplay footage, so you had to rent a video game to see if it was worth buying. Story 113. It felt slower. I was born in 1991 and still have many memories from before the internet got big. Life feels kind of like a blur now. Interactions were more memorable and more special. Story 114. You can open an electronic device and use it without registering or creating an account. Story 115. We had to go to the library and find books related to the subjects we were writing papers on. You either spent the day in the library or an hour or two scanning and photocopying pages at the slowest speeds imaginable. I kind of miss the pre-internet days. Story 116. It was filled with trips to the library to find books with the information you needed. Quietly searching the right row and shelf for the book you had located in the card catalog was the essence of analog. The internet is easier and quicker, but the smell of books in that calm space brings back many memories. Story 117. As a kid, I would call my friends on the landline to see if they were home and wanted to go play. Summers were spent outside all day. The scenes you see on television with kids riding bikes around neighborhoods. We did that until the sun went down. Our parents would yell down the street that it was dinner time to get us home. We played hockey in the streets and moved when cars came. They drove slow enough that it was safe. We had block parties where people spent the day eating, drinking, and talking. No cell phones. Parents talked while kids ran around, getting into trouble, throwing balls, riding bikes, and skateboarding. The time before being hooked to a mobile device and needing to know what was happening every second of the day was amazing. You did not know about the events of the day until you got home at night when the evening news came on. Story 118. I owned an encyclopedia and thought I would never need to go to the library again. Cell phones were owned by wealthy people with important jobs, were bulky, and had poor reception. Some cars, such as the Bayerische Motor and Werke 7 series, came with pre-installed phones. I rode in a 1990s model that had a phone in the console and thought it was better than a limo. Movies were better. Your parents let you watch restricted films like RoboCop, Cool World, or Under Siege with lots of action, gore for the time, and nudity before you were 10 years old. Malls were the social place to shop and hang out. Older kids born in the 1970s spent more time there, often skipping school or going after school. Going to the mall at Christmas was an annual event of fighting crowds, finding a parking spot, and shuffling between stores your parents were visiting until you finally saw the toys you wanted. The Toys R Us catalog was the best place to dream about the hottest toys, but my parents did not have much money, so getting anything expensive was incredible. My grandma took me to buy a Game Boy from there along with a few games. It was probably the best gift I ever got. I will never forget it. We used phone books at payphones to call someone when we did not know the number. See the original Terminator when he looks at the phone book hanging in the phone booth. We used the yellow pages to call a business for service. Electronic stores were much more crowded than they are today. Radio Shack actually sold parts for radios and electronics and supported hobbyists who wanted to build or repair their own equipment. They had walls of parts and a small section of toys or gadgets like remote-controlled cars or televisions. Story 119. People could just say things and you could not fact-check them. Marilyn Manson had a rib removed so that he could perform oral sex on himself. The first time you try ecstasy, there is a 50-50 chance you could die, but if you do not die the first time, you can use it forever and it will not kill you. If you inhale helium improperly, you could die. If you constantly overpluck your eyebrows, they will grow back. If someone hits you on the back of the head while you are crossing your eyes will be stuck like that forever. Story 120. If you did not go outside and play, your parents made you clean the house instead. We had to head home when the streetlights came on. The news would show an infographic. It is 10 in the evening. Do you know where your children are? We never feared being snatched or kidnapped. Story 121. We went out, stayed active, talked to live humans, and read books and newspapers. On balance, the internet, and especially the smartphone, have done far more harm than good, in my opinion. This comes from a career information technology professional, technology enthusiast, an extreme early adopter who used the internet when it was called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. Story 122. News came from well-funded sources competing to be accurate. Unlike today when anyone anywhere can say whatever they want from bot farms. People read more, listened to more music, spent more time together, and had deeper, more engaging conversations. Going to the library was important. To learn, you had to look up information in sources such as old newspapers and history books. If you wanted to see friends, you would get up and go to the coffee shop they hung out at or similar places. Radio was more important. Buying music was hit or miss, but you could make friends with record store employees and get recommendations that were often better than Spotify. When you traveled, it felt foreign. Now I can bring my child across the globe and still find boba or other universally available items. There were inconveniences such as owning physical media. In general, the country was on the same page. Now everything is niche, including facts. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.